on campus, but doing your own thing?
I work mostly at home.
Nice. Yeah. And we're live with Ian Smith. Ian Smith, hello, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon.
I'm really looking forward to our chat today. The book is called Pākehā Settlements in a Māori World. Oh, Jace, why don't you bring, I was going to do this thing, but you could just bring up put it into the thing. There it is there. Much easier to look at it like that. And you are an archaeologist.
Yes.
You are an honorary associate professor.
Yes.
Which means you are, as you were just saying, no longer actively teaching at Otago, but you are working in and around the university.
Still doing that, yes.
Now, first of all, to yourself and to those who are listening, I need to apologise. I've been frightfully sick for about 9 days. I'm not sick anymore, but I have this thing called cough variant asthma. And it means that after I've got over my illness, sometimes I have a bit of a cough that comes back. So I've got all sorts of sucky things and puffy things. And so if I have a bit of a cough today, I apologise. Now that I've said that, it won't happen, which is always embarrassing. So yeah, if I'm a bit husky and I'm a bit coughy, it's not that I'm sick, it's just that this asthma thing kicks in when I get sick. So apologies to you and apologies to anyone watching or listening to this as well. So I am fascinated in your story. Pākehā Settlements in a Māori World, New Zealand Archaeology, 1769 to 1860. I think many of us probably know about, get taught about, learn about, hear about sort of New Zealand post 1840, maybe even more so post 1900. You know, that 1840 to 1900 is a bit of a blank area for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And some of the things over the last kind of 10 or 15 years that I've been working with and friends I've made and people who have taught me various things are echoed in this book quite heavily of what I've got to look through. And let me just say, I will hold it up now because this book is absolutely gorgeous. It is, I mean, let me do this, hey Jace. The number of pictures, the way it's laid out, it is just, as I said to you before, I've had 3 people come to my house in the last few days, look at this sitting on my table going, oh, when you're done with that, and one person trying to actually take it, saying if you don't want that, and I'm like, no, I want that. Your background in archaeology. How do you get into being an archaeologist? It sounds like something that many of us growing up in the 80s would think of Indiana Jones and those sorts of people. How does one in the real world get into archaeology?
Well, for me, it happened when I was at university. Prior to that, I had no interest particularly in archaeology. Archaeology was something that happened in comics, really. So
you weren't the kind of kid who found an old rock and could see the seashell from a million years and go, well, that's interesting, that nothing at all.
No.
Wow, that's interesting.
No, when I was at university, one of the subjects that I took was anthropology, and the people who taught me in that were some of the most interesting teachers that I had, and that's what attracted me. And initially I was mostly interested in social anthropology and sort of the study of modern societies. Yeah. But again, it was the people who were teaching archaeology that drew me into that. And then I discovered that I could actually go out and do it myself, with them. And so by the time I was a third-year student, I was starting to participate in archaeology, and I had a research project to work on. Yep. And so on. So
yeah. That was based in New Zealand?
Yeah.
Because I guess I don't like saying a lot of people think, who knows? I wonder, let's just talk about me. I sort of think about archaeologists and I think about, Egypt and places that have got histories that are 10,000 years old, or dinosaurs millions of years ago. I think about New Zealand and I kind of go, no, we've been around a while, but it's a good archaeological country, is it?
It is. I mean, there's archaeology everywhere that people have been. There's archaeology, because archaeology is the material remains of people in the past. And for me, it doesn't really matter whether it's 800 years of archaeology or 8,000 or 800,000. What's interesting is the doing of it, because it's it's as close as you can get to being Doctor Who, I think.
Well, actually, I was just thinking then, if the archaeology is more kind of 500, 600, 700 years old, does that therefore mean an archaeological dig would be more plentiful than one that's 8,000 years old because things haven't deteriorated as much?
To some extent, that's true. It really depends on the kind of place it was in the beginning. I mean, if you have a place where people were camped for 2 days, you're not going to get much rubbish left behind. If you've got somewhere where people lived for 200 years, they're going to leave behind a lot of rubbish. Now, it doesn't matter whether that was 8 million years ago or 800 years ago. That same difference is going to be there. But the other thing is true as well, is that things do decay over time.
Yeah.
And the older they are, the more decay has taken place.
Is this something that I'm reminded of Mike Dickerson today, Jace, who was like New Zealand's only Wikipedian, and he was an expert in flightless birds, and so you think of the Moor, and you'd see him light up when he was talking about the Moor and stuff. The New Zealand's archaeology, is that something that you're in love with? Have you done it other parts of the world? Have you gone and done a dig in Egypt or Australia or somewhere else?
I've worked on excavations in the Pacific, but all of the archaeology that I've sort of generated myself has been in New Zealand.
Right.
And to me, that's what's really interesting, actually, because it's the archaeology of us.
Yeah, for sure.
And if we don't do it, nobody else is going to.
Is archaeology something that is, I'm trying to think of a way to say, is still as popular as ever? Are there still as many students going through? Are there archaeologists being trained? And is it a dying art? How does it go?
It's not a dying art. There's probably a steady number of people who are studying archaeology. You can do archaeology at Otago University and Auckland University,
right,
in New Zealand, and both places produce a steady stream of graduates, and there's a steady market for them out there too, because most of the work in archaeology is development-driven archaeology. So every time there's a new building going up, there's something being knocked down, there has to be an archaeological assessment, and sometimes that will mean there has to be an excavation. And so most of the students that come out of the university go into that kind of work.
So that would be that example of a new development, a building being built, that would be at the cost of the developer.
Yes.
They basically, part of their RMA or something is you have to do it to make sure this was not an archaeological significant site 500 years ago or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. So that means that archaeology is mostly a commercial entity.
It is, mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's the archaeology that's carried out at universities is research driven. So, when I was working at the university, I was one of the lucky people who get to make decisions about where I want to go and excavate. And as long as I can get the research money to do it, and I can get the approval of people who own the land and people who are the descendants of the community that lived there.
Yep.
If I can make all those things work, then I can go and do it.
Is there how does that happen? How does I understand the developer having to do it because he's got an end game and a necessity? How does it typically work that a site, out at Aramwana or over in Brighton or something gets started on? Is it that someone comes across one particular thing and you want to see if there's more, or how does that normally work?
Well, it happens in a number of different ways. There's a lot of sites that archaeologists already know of. We've had a site recording scheme going in New Zealand for more than 50 years, and there's something like 80,000 sites recorded on it, and constantly more being recorded all the time. With most development-driven archaeology, a developer, part of what they do in their resource management consenting process is they'll get an archaeologist to do a quick assessment. Is there anything here? Is there anything that needs to be done?
Right.
In terms of research work, when I've been planning excavations, I'm starting with an idea. I want to find out about what life was like on shore whaling stations or whatever. So where are those sites? I see what research has been done on that, and then I evaluate those sites. Which ones are going to be a good prospect for giving me the kind of evidence I want to recover?
And is that part of the start of your book? Wanting to know how Pākehā lived, sort of pre-treaty. Is that part of it?
That was a big part of it. I kind of, in a lot of ways, I sort of stumbled into doing that. I like most archaeologists of my age. When I started doing archaeology in New Zealand, it was Maori archaeology. Nobody did the archaeology of Pākehā at that time. because that was historians' business. But from...
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So historians looked at the Pākehā history.
Yeah.
Archaeologists looked at Māori history.
Yeah.
Because the Pākehā history was actually my great grandfather could have told me stories about that, so it's almost second or third hand.
Yeah, you had the written accounts, and you had the family histories passed down and so on. And I guess for a lot of people they would think, well, it's only 100 years ago, that's not very long, or whatever. But from about the mid 1970s. When there was the first legislation to protect archaeological sites, it was any site that's 100 years old or older.
Yeah.
So that included Pākehā sites as well as Māori sites. So archaeologists started to get involved in looking at Pākehā archaeology as well.
So is this something? So it's a general study now. You're not just like leading the way in this. Other archaeologists are doing this.
Other archaeologists are doing it. I've certainly been probably the main person who's forged the way in what we call historical archaeology in New Zealand, the archaeology of the period for which we've also got written history. But it's done all over the world, and increasingly it's done in New Zealand. But this is the first time anyone's written a book about it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Out of the book and out of the research, how long did this take? Because this is I know people who have done large factual books before that have taken them several years to write. This looks like a huge amount of research. What does this signify? How much of your life does this little thing signify?
Well, in some ways, it's 40 years of work.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, since I started doing archaeology, I guess 45 years. But in terms of the actual writing of the book, there's about probably 4 years involved in that. But in terms of seriously working on the projects that underlie what's in the book, I guess there's about 15 years work there.
Wow. And this will become, part of every archaeological course in New Zealand, I would think, this book.
I would hope so.
You would think it would be if this is the leading Bible for Pākehā Settlements and Māori World for this 90-year period.
It is. It's the only book.
The only book. So are there any other books about Pākehā? I nearly called it Archaeology. That's sort of putting them together. Pākehā Archaeology. Yeah, got it. Are there actually any other written resources for it?
There's a couple of other books which are sort of chapters written by different authors, including myself, that look at just little aspects of historical archaeology in New Zealand. There's a couple of books that have been written about sites, say, from the New Zealand Wars, and describing the archaeological sites as sort of field monuments that you can go and visit.
Yep.
But this is the only book that really tries to take the results of archaeology of part of that period and build it into a sort of a big coherent story.
And other than obviously it's part of your passion, did you see like a necessity for this resource to be out there? Did you see like a gap in the marketplace, so that this is going to sell well? What was the main driving thing to have this written down for, I guess, in perpetuity?
Well, definitely a gap in the market, although, I mean, that's, I guess, more for my publisher than for me. But for me, there was certainly, I guess from the general sort of ordinary Pākehā perception of our own history was, we had Captain Cook, and then there was the treaty, and then there were some wars, and then it's sort of World War One, and there's an awful lot got kind of skipped over in that, and when we think, I mean, so much of what happens in New Zealand today is framed by the way in which Māori and Pākehā interact with each other and towards each other. And what I could see in studying the early years of Māori and Pākehā encounter with each other is that that was the way things worked then is quite different from the way it worked later in the 19th century, through the 20th century, and the way it is now. So I thought it was really important for New Zealanders to be reminded of the way in which things started.
I worked as a talkback host for 10 years on Newstalk ZB, and of course an oft repeated cry of a talkback caller would be, we need to be one people, stop this division. And what I read in your book and my understanding from other learned people in this area is that when Pākehā turned up, we sort of were one people, because they lived alongside Māori and sort of adopted the Māori way of doing things. And I remember being told a story from Waitemata Harbour in Auckland that Māori basically had to look after Pākehā when they first turned up, because the new settlers didn't understand how to catch the local fish. So Māori would go out and do that and bring them back and support them. And then that turned into a commercial venture. And then, of course, when there was enough Pākehā to make the power move, they wouldn't allow Māori to come all the way into the docks. They'd have to offload the fish onto a boat, which was a Pākehā boat, halfway up in the harbour, and then those guys got to come in and sell it. And all these weird things, and it kind of felt like, and sorry to A, be crass, B, to oversimplify things, but it sounds like that basically, Europeans turned up, went Shangri-La, let's live with these people, let's work alongside them, let's learn from them, and then they got to a point where there was enough white people that they basically went, fuck it, we'll just do it our way from now on, you savages can go back to your own way.
I don't think it was necessarily quite as cynical as that.
All right, fair enough.
But for some people, it probably was. I mean, there were certainly some people who quite deliberately sort of were as Māori as they needed to be when it counted, but were perfectly happy to change when the political movement swung in it.
Well, like when the power balance changed.
Yeah.
So basically when Pākehā outnumbered Māori, things changed.
Yes. And the thing that defines the time period that is looked at in my book is that's the time period when Pākehā were the minority. That's... I mean, in some ways it's quite remarkable that it was only 90 years between Captain Cook, the first Pākehā, putting footsteps on the land.
And that was definitely a Cook. So Tasman didn't make it to the shore at all?
No, nobody got ashore with in Tasman's encounter. But only 90 years after that Pākehā outnumbered Māori. So that's an incredibly rapid...
Yeah, so Māori were here for 600, 700 years by themselves. Pākehā turned up, and within 90 years were the dominant group.
They outnumbered them, and that's just because of the incredible rate of immigration, basically. And there was also a very high, what's called hyper-reproduction, the Pākehā families.
So they were going for it, in other words.
Yeah, their families were bigger and healthier than those in Britain.
I've got a really stupid question for you. First time I've ever thought of this question, but I'm really interested by it. Is there a record for the first Pākehā born in New Zealand? Like the original Pākehā New Zealander? Like a pregnant lady came across on the ship, baby. Do you know?
Yep.
There is?
Yep. 1814, when the... December 1814, when the first missionaries were arriving at the Hohi mission station in the Bay of Islands, Hannah King, the wife of one of the missionaries, was heavily pregnant.
Right.
And she, in order to get from the ship to shore, she had to be hoisted in a chair.
Oh, yeah.
And anyway, a few weeks later, their child was born. So that was the first Pākehā born in New Zealand.
That sounds like, the way you say that, it sounds like it's knowledge everyone should know, but I didn't know that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, having worked in this area for a long time, working in different places around the country, you come across local histories that will say, this is the first white woman born in New Zealand. There's about at least half a dozen different claims,
Right.
and they're all made in good faith, but in ignorance of what's happened elsewhere in the country. Sure. And so it's only by putting together things from all over the place that you can actually figure out these firsts.
So Pākehā turned up. They basically, I'm simplifying it over paraphrasing, and you can just expand on this.
Just sort of jump in, unless I'm getting my names confused. They were married by Samuel Marsden.
They were.
So there you go. Is that because that's Marsden from Marsden College we were talking about a while back? Yeah. So there you go. This little small world. Well, I suppose there wasn't that many people. So just my thing here says there, Samuel Marsden was the people who married the husband and wife who gave birth to the first Pākehā person in New Zealand.
There you go. And then Māori the world over gnashed their teeth forevermore. So Pākehā turned up, Europeans turned up. They set up alongside, I should have marked it, there's a delightful picture in here of Māori fishing off the beach and a little white tent in the distance where Pākehā are kind of setting up camp, or literally, to live for a while sort of thing. And the picture basically says, shows them living literally side by side. They lived like that until the population sort of switched, or did once there was enough Pākehā turned up, did they start to kind of form towns and settlements outside of Māori, or how did that work?
The initial settlements were mostly sort of quite, if you like, specialised, single focus kind of places, like they were sealing camps, or they were whaling stations or timber stations, and most of those involved both Māori and Pākehā working together, and that's just simply the way they worked. It was necessary for the Pākehā to work with Māori to get the food. Māori were a big part of the labour in these operations and so on. And also, the Pākehā had to have use rights for these resources. If they didn't negotiate use rights, they would generally get run out of town.
So negotiate with Māori?
Yeah.
So, for example, if they were going whaling, would they still do that? Māori considered the sea, obviously we know about foreshore and seabed, they considered the sea to be theirs, they'd have to get rights to go hunt whales? There
would be negotiations. Very often there would be an arranged marriage between the head of the station, whaling station, and daughter of a local chief,
right?
Which sort of bound the two communities together, and sort of reinforced their dependence on each other.
And in that situation, did those early people speak Māori? Did the Māori learn English, or do they use lots of hand signals?
A lot of both, I think.
Okay.
I mean, I think that, and I think you can see it on both sides. There were people who were sort of really good at working the cross-cultural encounter and making it work. There were some Māori who could see the opportunities to, if you like, enhance their own mana and power through controlling access to Pākehā things. They would utilise that situation to their own advantage.
Yeah.
Equally, there were Pākehā who were, they were interested in the commercial opportunities and so on.
So even though we hear stories about, they bought this land for 3 blankets and a bunch of beads, it sounds like what you're saying is that some Māori were pretty business savvy. And they were like, this is mine, or this is ours. If you want access, we need to negotiate. However, that would have worked 200 years ago.
Yeah, it did, and it worked. I mean, there were good deals and there were bad deals, and it's very difficult to sort of characterise them all in a single way. But by and large, these were negotiated outcomes. There were certainly, particularly later on, once. After the treaty, in fact, where you've got this sudden influx of new settlers coming, the need to provide land for them, this is where you started to get a lot of the really shonky deals, where particularly the New Zealand company, they were so desperate to get the land to have a town to put these new settlers in who were on a ship already coming, that they would quite knowingly negotiate with some people who they knew didn't really have the rights to sell what they were trying to buy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what happened in the case of Wellington, for example, and Wanganui as well. But to get back to one of your earlier questions, the thing that really changed was when Pākehā started living in towns.
Right.
Because the towns sort of concentrated more and more Pākehā into them, and they became a place where...
Separated them from Māori as well. Yeah,
they sort of became insulated from the Māori world. Even though those early towns were still dependent on Māori for food. Most of the food was being produced by Māori, both, not just fish and so on. They were Māori were growing most of the grain that was feeding Auckland, for example, and indeed a lot of Australian cities in the 1850s.
Wow.
So they were economically dependent, but they started to become sort of culturally more independent of Māori, and it was part of that sort of swinging of the pendulum when the Pākehā population got big enough that it was possible for them to first of all ignore Māori demands and then to exert their own hegemony, if you like, you know, and essentially invade Māori territory, steal their land, confiscate it, and so on, and all of those things that happened in the 1860s and 70s with brutal military force.
I'm interested, we often talk about how New Zealand did it differently with the treaty, and that doesn't mean that obviously we've got it right today or that it was perfect then, but compared to places like, Australia and the US, where basically they just aim to wipe out the natives and come and take the land. I'm interested somewhere like the US, when the early settlers turned up there, do you have any knowledge of, was it a similar situation? In other words, did the early settlers, the pilgrims as they call them, work alongside the Native Americans and then it turned into a bloodbath? Or the settlers that came to New Zealand, were they different from other colonies? Like, was it a different way of doing things on the first few days?
I think one of the things that made New Zealand different is when it happened. New Zealand was very sort of late in the historical sequence of colonisation events by Europeans, Euro-Americans. So I guess that meant that a lot of the things that had been tried before and had been found to fail were no longer being pursued, and I guess that's one of the reasons that a treaty was sort of at the forefront of the way in which it was done in New Zealand.
That's how I've always understood it as well. Almost like settlers or colonists went, we've done this all sorts of other terrible ways. Let's try a new way of doing it.
It wasn't exactly new. I mean, we talk about North America almost as if it was a single event of colonisation. In fact, you've got multiple colonisations that happened over a period of several hundred years in different parts of North America.
Yeah, true.
And in some of those, you've got treaties which are actually quite similar to those in New Zealand, and some of them adhered to by people on both sides, in most cases not. So I think that timing plays a big part in that.
Right. Yeah, my understanding is there are some treaties, especially on the border of Canada and America, which are quite similar to Treaty of Waitangi. It's interesting. Maybe purely because of our size. It's more of a nationwide, one hit, let's get into it sort of thing. Yeah.
I think another thing that's different, and it's, I think, helps to explain differences between New Zealand and Australia, where, it's their colonisation is pretty similar in terms of time.
Right.
The difference is that in Australia it starts with convict settlements. But I think one of the things that is really different is in the New Zealand case, the Maori response to these new people was quite different from the Aboriginal response in Australia, in that I think that Maori showed much more inclination to engage in trade, and to be a sort of an active participant in changing the world around them, much more than was the case for in most parts of Australia. And so and I think that has had a long-term impact on the nature of race relations in the two countries.
Yeah. I'm thinking about those early Australian settlers, convicts, and those who looked after the convicts, basically. Whereas people moving here, free men and women, I guess. I wonder how in Australia Aborigines would have interacted with those people. I mean, when they got to Australia, was their sentence go to Australia, or was their sentence go to Australia in due time?
It was go to Australia in due time.
So the Aborigines probably wouldn't have had access to those settlers if they were doing time, quote unquote.
Well, yes and no. I mean, part of doing time often meant that you were assigned to work as a farm labourer for somebody or whatever. So you weren't necessarily incarcerated. I mean, simply being in Australia was incarceration enough.
Still is, isn't it? Whereas, but the people, I mean, I know it's a bit of a joke and a bit of a slag like I just did then, but, you know, the people who came to Australia were convicts. The people that came to New Zealand were number 8 wire, 2x4 kind of, were, what's the word, explorers. Well, that was the difference. And so maybe that was part of the reason that in New Zealand there was a change of things. They were like, we're on an adventure, you know, we want to explore, we want to go and make the best of what's going on, we want to interact with these people, whereas people in Australia didn't want to be there, so why would that try?
I don't know, there might be a certain amount of that, but there was an incredible amount of movement of people backwards and forwards across the Tasman, particularly in this early period. I mean, just about all of the men who came to New Zealand in sealing gangs were signed on in either Sydney or Hobart. And most of them were ex-convicts.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that kind of starts to undo that kind of difference that you've been trying to suggest there.
Maybe I'm just talking out my head.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it through. Because I love the feel. Shall I say the intention? Again, I don't want to imply that we've got it right, but the intention of working together, especially at the start, this idea that we'd go into, we being, you know, I guess white people, early settlers, the early settlers would come into New Zealand and go, let's work alongside this group of people who know this place. That feels completely contrary to how we hear about colonisation. You know, the English wanting to bring England. That's why some idiot brought hedgehogs to New Zealand, because they wanted to see frickin' hedgehogs in their backyard. Who cares about that today? You know, it feels contrary to how I've learned about colonisation. And it also seems to be, if someone was to colonise, quote unquote, a country today, or let's speak into the future, a planet, that would be the way you'd want to do it. Go in and work alongside and learn from, rather than go in and trying to take, you know, a little bit of Dunedin into wherever else. Although if you're going to take something, you should take Dunedin. Dunedin would be the thing to take.
Are we going to teach the Martians to binge drink, are we?
Yep. And we'll take our cough variant asthma over there with them and wipe them all out. Is that right? So what I'm saying is I'm a bit sad. It's because that sounds like a great way to start.
It was,
and then we cocked it up along the way.
I think that one of the things we have to acknowledge is that it's not just about how those colonists who came to New Zealand were thinking.
Yeah,
it's they could only do what Maori let them do.
Yeah, it was about how Māori responded.
Yeah. I mean, every Pākehā who was in New Zealand up to 1840, probably up to 1850, was here at the goodwill of Maori. They could have been run into the sea at any time had Maori chosen to do that. So, you know, they did what they were allowed to do.
And that just again it leads you to when I say leads you, I mean leads one to think about how I'm thinking about the stories from the 1950s about Māori being hit in schools for speaking their language, and having to fight to get the Raglan golf course back, although it was something that they lent to the government during wartime and then the government never gave back. It just makes all of those things feel extra slighted. It's an extra slap in the face. Whereas on day one, if Māori had gone no, then it would have been no. Then this place would be a Pacific island if they had have done that.
Indeed. Well, and they started so well. I mean, the first school in New Zealand, which was at the Hohi Mission Station, opened in 1816, I think. It taught Māori children te reo. They weren't teaching them English, they were teaching them te reo. And, it's only much later that that the Māori being, stopped from learning their own language in schools came along. That's it.
So is there a point? Is there something that happened at some stage that was the tipping point? Or was it more of a slow creep?
I think it was a process rather than an event.
Yeah.
And I think that the biggest part of that process is just a population growth. It's a swamping. Māori were swamped by this. And I mean, not only Māori, the Pākehā who were here in that first sort of generation, who were living alongside and with Māori, often married to Māori, often with mixed race families.
Yeah.
I mean, when this enormous hundreds of thousands of people out of London and Edinburgh and so on started swarming into New Zealand, those people were feeling isolated too. They were being sort of pushed aside by this new there's a period of about 15 or so years from in the 1860s and 1870s where there were more people born outside of New Zealand in the New Zealand population than people born inside New Zealand.
Right.
That's how many, there were so many migrants coming in. Yeah.
It's thinking, I mean, I'm a visual person and I'm thinking about that person who was over here in, let's say 1790, living alongside Māori, and then, I know it wasn't a £10 pom back then, but the equivalent of turned up. That would be, because those would have been whatever they called themselves, but certainly sort of the original New Zealanders, as we would deem New Zealand, not the original inhabitants, but of that country, having all these foreigners, although they might have come from their hometown. They might just have been away from their hometown for 30 years, but now the stranger turns up with their strange ways, and they might have been their neighbour 30 years ago.
Indeed. Yeah.
Gosh. Doing this particular book, the Pākehā Settlements in a Māori World, anything you found that particularly surprised you? Like anything that you were shocked by or pleasantly surprised by, or anything that comes to mind?
There are lots of wonderfully interesting finds. There always are when you're digging in the ground.
Yep.
I don't know if there's anything that super surprised me, because I kind of had a sort of feel for what was...
And you've been doing this for a lifetime.
Yeah, I guess so. But, I mean, some of the things that we found were really special.
Like what?
Things. For example, at the Hohi Mission Station, when we started excavating there, we knew, that this had been the first permanent Pākehā settlement in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
We knew that there'd been a school there. We didn't know where any of these things were on the ground, and I just looked around and decided that this looked like the best place to start digging.
Like if I was going to build a school, I would build it here.
Well, yeah. And when we, the first day we were digging, turned back the turf, there's some pieces of slate and some slate pencils.
Wow.
This is the stuff from the first school in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And then some toys, little toys that had been used as basically as bribes to bribe the Maori children to learn their lessons, Things like little glass beads. There's a little toy brass cannon about 2 inches long.
Wow.
A mouth harp. Things like that. That, at one level, they told us, okay, we know we've got the school now because
Yep.
we've got all these things from the school.
Yep.
But also, these things are so personal. I mean, these are things that Māori children, who were the first children to ever attend a mission school in New Zealand, were using. And some of the slate pencils have got little marks. They've been had little crosses scratched on them. So someone's marking it, that's mine,
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember, and I've told this story before, I don't know in what capacity, but you get those moments. I'm sure you must. That sounds like a moment where you kind of go, holy mackerel, this was a kid who actually, this is their handwriting. One of those grand designs type programs where they were converting old houses and, getting 100-year-old houses and putting new kitchens and all that kind of jazz. And this place had a house that was, part of it was built in the 1400s. And they pulled the equivalent of jib off, and they were going to do this, and they found a clay wall. And in that clay wall, there was handprints from actually making the wall. And those handprints were, 700 years old from the person who lived there and made it. And I was just like, and then obviously because it was a flash thing, they exposed it and they left it exposed. But I just thought, that would stop my heart to see something like that. And it must be on a shorter time frame level, the similar sort of thing where you see this Māori kid has put his X in there and this is mine, and that gives it ownership, that belonged to someone. That'd be like finding someone's signature on something from a European settlement.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. This book, this beautiful, beautiful book, is this available to the public? And if it is, where do they get it from?
It's in all good bookshops.
There we go. Mighty Ape, $60.
Yep.
Great stocking stuffer. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
I was going to ask you as well. I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm sure we don't zoom in and get it. But if I do this, Jace, can you see the blue lines there at all? Does that work?
It is working, yes. You can see the blue lines, so you can talk to it.
So we are in Dunedin.
Yep.
That is a picture of the Octagon, which is, 300-400 metres from the current water edge. And you can see the reclaimed land goes up to the outer Octagon, a place for people who don't know Dunedin called Moray Place. And I'm amazed, and you've got other pictures in here from other settlements as well. I think Wellington's in here and some other pictures. How much land was reclaimed? How does that work from an archaeological point of view? I mean, reclaimed land is basically new land. Is that a good archaeological site? Is it more important just to acknowledge where the shoreline was? What's the purpose of bringing out this is where the shoreline was and this is where it is now?
Well, it tells us two things. Obviously, the only places that people can have lived on before reclamation are, on the ground that hasn't been reclaimed.
Yep.
And so if we're going to try and find those early sites, then we're not going to look out where the reclamation is. But the reclamation itself is interesting because the way in which all of that land was reclaimed was by dumping rubbish into it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, speaking of this, so this, Jason, if we can embed this, the imagery we've got in here, the blue, if people can see this, if you can't see this, go to YouTube and have a look at the video. The blue highlight, the original shoreline, actually on your image goes up higher, doesn't it? Goes up there towards the Octagon. So obviously there's
That's right.
Is there conjecture over that then, or is
No,
this a bit off?
Well, that's only a small part. Yeah. There was a very good map drawn by Charles Kettle in 1846 or 7 when he originally surveyed the site of Dunedin.
Yep.
And that shows the shore of this great big lagoon that comes in, into right where Countdown Supermarket is, and
Right.
the police station
Yeah.
is sitting on top of this lagoon. And indeed, where they're putting the new hospital,
where Cadbury's is now, on the one-ways.
Part of that is reclaimed land as well, which just means they're going to have deeper foundations and so on.
So the two things are, as you said, you don't go look in there because it's new land, and also they fill it with rubbish.
Yeah, but which tells us about the archaeology of later times.
Oh, because you can look at the rubbish.
Yeah. For example, when they developed the Chinese garden, they discovered that when that part had been filled, you can see individual cartloads of rubbish that have been tipped in there. And there was one cartload that was all offcuts from a shoe or boot maker, bits of offcuts from partly made boots and shoes and stuff like that, just in a big pile. And and then a whole lot of clay and other stuff was dumped in there, and there were loads of stuff from soft drink manufacturers, broken bottles and stuff like that.
So actually, that means reclaimed land is an archaeological site, but of more recent times.
Yes.
Wow. Never thought about that.
Yeah, and so there's been archaeology done on those kind of sites in Dunedin and Wellington and in Auckland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic book. I've loved it. I've read a lot of it. There is a lot of information in here. This is one of the things when you're sick in bed for 9 days. This was my constant companion. Again, people can find it in every good bookstore. Pākehā Settlements in a Māori World, New Zealand Archaeology, 1769 to 1860. Is there anything you want to leave us with? I'm just kind of thinking, my head's still on this point. I'm not trying to go on here about how I feel a bit sad about how we started and where we're at today. And and this is maybe almost more of a sociological conversation now, but how do we get there? How do we go back to this, working alongside and not being quite so divided? And although we are better than most countries, I would say that it still feels like there's always some work to do. And we what we could have been versus what we are, sort of thing.
Well, I think that we're better than we have been.
Yep.
Which is an improvement. And I think that the more we look at and understand our past and accept our past for what it is, then the more we can bring that into how we operate in the present. So there's value in looking at the past to try and help us to negotiate the present.
And there's that idea that if you don't acknowledge and address the past, you're doomed to repeat it as well.
Yes.
So that's an important thing to perhaps look into. Ian Smith, Pākehā Settlements in a Māori World. As I said, great stocking stuffer. As I said, for people who are thinking, this is not necessarily a Christmas present. It's an anytime buy, but I've had three visitors in the last 5 days saw this on my table. All three of them wanted to read it next. So I would say that this would be an absolute slam dunk for anyone looking for an impressive, and it's in New Zealand. I think about coffee table books and books you can flick through and books you can read, and it's just so much New Zealand. There's so many good pictures and so many good yarns in there and stories and teachings and learnings and stuff. I think that it's a fabulous. When I saw you popping up on an events calendar here in Dunedin, I knew I wanted to talk to you straight away. So thank you, Ian Smith, for coming in. And as I said again, people, Pākehā Settlements in a Māori World. What do you reckon, Jace? Everyone should get one for Christmas, I reckon.
Yeah. For those hard to buy for people that have a coffee table. It's I'd say it's more than a coffee table book of lovely pictures. But if you're sitting at the coffee table and your phone dies, the phone battery dies, and you want to read something other than Facebook.
I'm thinking of a particularly wise 60-ish person that I know, guy. He's an RNZ listener. He's that kind of person. He would just he'll buy this in a heartbeat. So I think that there's a market for this, and I hope you do really well with it. It's an amazing book, and thank you for coming in.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.